Welcome to Seraphina Romance Audiobook.
Chapter 1. The Glass and the Iron. My fated mate is a cold-blooded killer, but the human woman stitching up my scout has hands like a warm spring breeze. I stood in the corner of the fringe clinic, my broad shoulders nearly brushing the cedar rafters. The air here smelled of dried lavender and sharp antiseptic, a strange, peaceful contrast to the copper tang of wolf blood spilling onto the table. Truth be told, I felt like a monster in a dollhouse. I watched Clara Vance move with a quiet, steady rhythm. Her fingers were small, pale, and looked as though they might snap under the slightest pressure. Yet, they didn't tremble. Not even once. "He's going to lose the leg if you don't hurry," I growled, my voice vibrating deep in my chest like distant thunder. I didn't mean to be cruel, but my heart was a heavy stone in my ribs because my people were dying while I played diplomat. Clara didn't look up from the jagged tear in the scout's thigh. "He'll lose the leg if I rush and nick the artery, Silas. Sit down. You're hogging all the light." I stiffened. No one in the Blackwood Territory talked to the king that way. Not only that, but she had used my name without a title. It was as if my crown meant nothing to her. I stepped closer, my shadow swallowing her small frame. I could smell her, warm skin, vanilla, and the faint, sweet scent of rain. It was intoxicating. It was dangerous. In fact, she was a fragile creature of glass living in a world of iron and teeth. Why wasn't she afraid? "You're a human," I muttered, almost to myself. "You should be hiding behind your deadbolts, not touching a wounded alpha." Clara finally looked up. The moment our eyes locked, the air in the room thickened. Her eyes were a soft, mossy green, devoid of the submissive flicker I expected. She stared right into the gold of my gaze, seeing the beast and the man. And she didn't blink. She didn't flinch. "Blood is blood, Silas," she said softly. Her voice was a velvet caress against my frayed nerves. "And pain doesn't care about your rank. Now hold his pulse. I need to close the deep muscle." I obeyed. My body moved on instinct, my large hand covering the scout's wrist. I felt the thrum of life beneath his skin, but all I could focus on was the heat of Clara's arm as it brushed mine. Her skin was so soft, too soft. She was a reminder of everything I could never have. I was bound to Alara by the moon goddess herself, a bond that felt like a chokehold. Alara was power. Alara was destiny. But Clara was a choice I wasn't allowed to make. "Is he going to make it?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low murmur. "He's strong," she replied, her eyes returning to her work. "But even the strong need a place to heal." Still, I knew the truth. My world didn't allow for healing. It only allowed for survival of the fittest. As the silence stretched, I found myself watching the way her hair fell over her shoulder. I wanted to reach out and tuck it back, to feel the silk of it against my calloused skin. But I pulled my hand away as if it was burning. Deep down, I knew the truth. I was a king of wolves, and she was a woman who belonged in the sun. "The pack is moving to the Great Hall tonight," I said, my tone turning professional and cold. "The winter storm is coming. Stay inside, Clara. Don't come to the border." "I have animals to check on, Silas. Life doesn't stop because you're worried about the snow." She was stubborn. She was magnificent. What's worse, she was right. I turned to leave, the heavy wooden door creaking under my grip. I paused at the threshold, the cold mountain air hitting my face. "Clara?" I said, not looking back. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" "Because," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "You're the only one in this forest who looks like he's actually carrying the world on his back. Hard to be scared of a man who's that tired." Her words cut through my armor better than any silver blade. I walked out into the night, my heart skippy. Chapter 2. The Suffocating Crown. What followed was a return to the nightmare I called a home. The Great Hall was a fortress of stone and ego, lit by flickering torches that cast long, predatory shadows on the walls. I sat on the obsidian throne, my fingers digging into the cold armrests. Beside me sat Alara. She was beautiful in a way that felt like a warning, sharp cheekbones, eyes the color of ice, and a smile that never reached her soul. "The scout is back," she said, her voice a piercing chime that made my teeth ache. "Waste of supplies, Silas. He was too weak to keep up with the hunt. Nature would have taken him if you hadn't sent him to that human." She spat the word human like it was poison. I felt a growl rise in my throat, a primal sound that echoed off the high ceiling. Alara didn't even blink. She knew the bond protected her. We were fated, a divine joke played by a goddess who clearly had a dark sense of humor. "He is a father of 3, Alara," I snapped, "and he is a loyal soldier. We don't leave our own to rot." "We are wolves, not nurses," she countered, leaning back and admiring her manicured claws. "Strength is our only currency. This obsession you have with the fringe, it's beneath an alpha king. It makes you look soft. It makes us look soft." Truth be told, I had never felt less like an alpha than I did in that moment. I was a king who couldn't even choose his own partner. I was a leader who was told that empathy was a defect. I looked at her, and all I saw was a void where a heart should be. She was the true Luna by birthright, yet she couldn't care less if the pack starved as long as her wine was cold and her furs were soft. "The great hunt starts tomorrow," I said, trying to change the subject before I did something I'd regret. "The pups are being moved to the lower valley for safety. The blizzard is going to be a bad one." "Let them move," she shrugged. "If they can't survive a little cold, they aren't fit to lead the next generation anyway. It's nature's way, Silas. Why do you fight it so hard?" Because of that one question, I realized the depth of the canyon between us. She saw the world as a slaughterhouse. I saw it as a sanctuary I was failing to protect. I stood up, the movement sudden and violent. My chair screeched against the stone. "I am going to check the perimeter," I growled. "Again?" She laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "You're looking for her, aren't you? That little vet with the dirty fingernails? You're pathetic, Silas. You're a king chasing a mouse." I didn't answer. I couldn't. If I spoke, the wolf inside me would take over, and the great hall would run red. I turned my back on her, my cloak billowing behind me like a funeral shroud. Between us, something cracked, a tiny fissure in the foundation of our fated bond. I felt it, clear as day. It wasn't broken, but it was strained. Moments later, I was outside in the biting wind. The moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky. I felt more alpha in the presence of Clara's quiet strength than I ever did under Alara's cold rule. It was a terrifying realization. If the king didn't believe in the bond, what hope did the pack have? I walked toward the edge of the cliffs, looking down at the tiny spark of light from the fringe. It was Clara's clinic. She was still awake. She was probably reading a book or cleaning her tools, blissfully unaware that the king of the monsters was staring at her window like a beggar at a banquet. "Silas?" I turned. It was my nephew, Leo. The boy was barely 8, with wide, trusting eyes and a mop of messy brown hair. He was the future of my line, the only thing that made this burden worth carrying. "Why are you out here alone, Uncle?" "Just thinking, Leo," I said, ruffling his hair. "Go back inside. The wind is picking up." "Is the lady at the clinic okay?" he asked, pointing down at the light. "She gave me a lollipop once when I scraped my knee. She's nice." "She is," I whispered. "She's very nice." But as the silence roared around us, I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The air smelled wrong. It smelled of ancient ice and forgotten graves. Beneath the moonlight, the shadows seemed to stretch toward the clinic, hungry and dark. I felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it made my bones ache. "Get inside, Leo. Now." The boy scurried away, frightened by the sudden edge in my voice. I stayed at the cliff's edge, my pulse racing. Something was coming. Something that didn't care about fated mates or pack laws. and Clara was right in its path. Chapter 3. The Scent of Death Frost. That night, sleep was an impossible dream. I paced my chambers, my wolf pacing inside my mind, claws scratching at the cage of my ribs. The window panes rattled in their frames as the wind began to howl, a mournful sound that felt like a warning. I went to the balcony, the stone freezing beneath my bare feet. As the sky darkened, the stars were snuffed out one by a wall of white. The blizzard wasn't just coming, it was attacking. But this wasn't a normal storm. The wind carried a scent of death frost, a smell of stagnant water and rotted pine that only the oldest legends spoke of. It was a supernatural frost, a curse that froze the soul before it froze the blood. Without thinking, I grabbed my heavy leather tunic and boots. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I needed to see the border. I needed to know the fringe was still there. "Where are you going?" Alara stood in the doorway, wrapped in a robe of white wolf fur. She looked like a ghost in the dim light. "The storm," I said, my voice thick. "It's not right. I need to check the outposts." "The outposts are fine, Silas. They are wolves. They can handle a bit of snow. Come back to bed." "It's not just snow," I growled, pushing past her. "Can't you smell it? The rot?" "I smell nothing but your own fear," she spat, her eyes flashing silver. "You're looking for an excuse to go to her. If you step out that door, Silas, I will tell the elders you've abandoned your post for a human. I will make sure they strip you of your title before the sun rises." I stopped. The threat was real. The elders were traditionalists. They worshipped the fated bond like a law of physics. If they thought I was straying, the pack would descend into civil war. Yet, as the wind shifted, I heard a sound that made my blood turn to ice. It was a gunshot. A single sharp crack echoing from the direction of the fringe. "Clara. She's in trouble," I whispered, my world tilting. "Then let her die," Ilara screamed, her face contorting with rage. "Let the frost take her. She is nothing, a parasite on our borders." I looked at Ilara, and for a fleeting moment I saw her for exactly what she was. A beautiful shell with nothing inside but spite. I realized I didn't care about the crown. I didn't care about the elders. If Clara Vance died in the cold because I was too afraid to be a man instead of a king, then I deserved to lose everything. "Stay here then, Luna," I said, the title tasting like ash. "Enjoy your warmth." I ran. I didn't use the stairs. I shifted mid-air as I leapt from the balcony. The transformation was a violent, familiar agony, bones snapping and reforming, skin stretching, fur bursting through muscle. It was a roar of heat in a world of ice. I hit the ground as a massive black wolf, my paws digging into the fresh snow. I didn't head for the outposts. I headed for the clinic. The wind whipped my fur, and the death frost tried to numb my limbs. But I pushed through. I was a blur of shadow against the white. To make things worse, the moon above began to change. A dark, crimson shadow crept across its surface. The moon was eclipsed by a blood-red cloud, the omen of the great hunt. It was the sign that blood would be spilled, and the goddess would be watching. By the time I reached the fringe, the snow was waist-deep. I shifted back into my human form, gasping for air, the cold searing my lungs. I looked toward Clara's cabin. The light was out. The front door was hanging open, swinging violently on its hinges. The clinic was empty. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the darkness. There was no sign of a struggle, but her medical bag was gone. Her heavy winter coat was gone. I looked out the back door, toward the frozen barrens. There, barely visible in the swirling white, were a set of small human footprints leading straight into the heart of the storm. "No," I breathed, the word disappearing into the wind. She had gone out there. She had heard the pup's transport go missing. I could hear the frantic howls of the scouts in the distance now. She was a human veterinarian with no fur and no claws, and she had walked into a supernatural blizzard to save wolf children that weren't even hers. In that moment, everything changed. I felt a shift deep in my soul, a snapping of the chains that had held me to Ilara. I realized that true Luna wasn't a mark on a wrist or a blessing from a priest. It was the woman who walked into the dark when everyone else stayed by the fire. "Clara!" I roared, but the storm swallowed my voice. I didn't hesitate. I followed the footprints. I crossed the threshold into the barrens, knowing that the elders would call it treason and the pack would call it madness. Still, I didn't care. With every heartbeat, I felt the bond to the pack pulse, but it was being drowned out by something else. Something older. Something real. As the sky darkened and the red moon cast a ghastly light over the snow, I realized I wasn't just a king anymore. I was a man on a hunt, and I wouldn't stop until I brought my heart home. Chapter 4: The Heresy of Mercy. The blizzard didn't just bite, it chewed. I lunged through the drifts, my human skin screaming as the death frost began to crystallize in the air. Still, I pushed forward because the scent of lavender and antiseptic was fading beneath the heavy, iron smell of the storm. I reached the Great Hall's perimeter just as the first search party was being called back. My warriors stood like statues of ice, their fur matted with frozen blood. "Silas! Stop!" It was Håkon, my lead scout. He grabbed my shoulder, his grip like a vice. Despite that, I tried to shake him off, my eyes fixed on the white abyss of the barrens. "The pups, Håkon!" I gasped, my breath hitching in the sub-zero air. "The transport, it never made it to the valley." "We know," Håkon shouted over the roar of the wind. "But the elders, they've forbidden a recovery. They say the storm is a judgment. If we enter the barrens now, we won't just lose the children, we'll lose the entire guard." "Let me go," I growled, the wolf beneath my skin snapping at the bit. "Clara is out there. She went after them." What followed was a silence more chilling than the wind. Håkon's eyes widened, reflecting the eerie, blood-red glow of the eclipsed moon. Before he could speak, the heavy iron doors of the hall groaned open. Alara stepped out, flanked by 3 silver-cloaked elders. She looked down at me from the stone stairs, her expression a mask of porcelain perfection. "The human is dead, Silas," she declared, her voice amplified by the stone walls. "And if you follow her, you are choosing a corpse over your crown." "She is worth 10 of you!" I roared, the truth ripping out of me like a physical wound. "Is that so?" Alara stepped down, her eyes burning with a hateful light. "Then go. Cross that line. But know this. The moment you step into the barrens, you are no longer king. You are a traitor, and nature will take its due." She stood in the doorway, blocking the path back to warmth, claiming searching was heresy against nature's culling. I looked at her, then at the frozen wasteland behind me. In that moment, everything changed. I realized that a throne built on the bones of children wasn't a seat of power. It was a grave. Chapter 5: Footprints in the Grave. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reply. Instead, I turned my back on the hall and the fated life that had been a slow-motion execution. I broke into a run, my boots sinking deep into the drifts. Behind me, I heard the elders' chants of condemnation, but they were drowned out by the thrum of my own heart. Soon after, I reached the point where the footprints began to vanish. The barrens were a labyrinth of jagged pine and shifting snow. Here, a wolf's senses were a curse. The wind whipped the scent of the pups into 1,000 directions, making it impossible to track. I felt a surge of self-loathing because I had spent my life relying on my supernatural blood. Now, in the face of a real storm, I was as blind as any mortal. "Clara!" I howled, my voice cracking. No matter how hard I tried, the forest wouldn't answer. I found a scrap of blue wool caught on a thorn bush, a piece of the smallest pup's cloak. Just like that, the gravity of the situation hit me. They weren't just lost, they were being hunted by the frost itself. I stumbled over a fallen log, my hands hitting the ice. I was freezing. My healing factor was working overtime, but it was a losing battle against the death frost. Yet, as I looked at the ground, I saw something that made my pulse race. A small, shallow depression in the snow. It wasn't a wolf's print. It was the mark of a heavy winter boot, Clara's boot. Beside it, there were smaller marks, dragged and uneven. She was carrying them. She was actually carrying the unblooded pups through a whiteout that was killing me. "How?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was the sheer, stubborn will of a woman who refused to believe in nature's way. I realized then that my internal flaw, my belief that humans were glass, was the biggest lie I had ever told myself. Clara wasn't glass. She was a diamond, formed under a pressure I couldn't even imagine. Chapter 6. Into the White Silence. I pushed deeper into the barrens, shedding my royal mantle as I went. The heavy fur cloak was only slowing me down, catching on the brush. I followed the scent of her human soap, a faint, dying trail of lavender that felt like a lifeline in a world of rot. The air thickened, turning a sickly shade of gray as the eclipse reached its peak. I was losing time. My limbs felt like lead, and my vision was beginning to blur. Truth be told, I didn't know if I was going to make it. But then, as the wind shifted, I smelled something that didn't belong in the barrens. Smoke. Chemical, sharp, and medicinal. It was the scent of a flare. "Clara!" I screamed, using the last of my strength to lunge toward the smell. The storm seemed to roar in protest, a wall of white slamming into my chest. I fell to my knees, the cold finally reaching my heart. I felt the pack bond flickering, the voices of the elders in my head telling me to give up, to die with dignity as a king. Rather, I chose to live as a man. I forced myself up, my muscles screaming. I saw a flicker of orange light against the side of a limestone cliff. It was a cave, a narrow, hidden slit in the rock that I would have missed if not for the smoke. I crawled toward it, my fingers numb and bloody. I reached the entrance and collapsed. There, in the dim, flickering light of a chemical fire, I saw her. Clara was stripped down to her base layers, her jacket and sweaters wrapped around 4 huddling, shivering pups. She was rubbing the smallest one's hands, her own skin a terrifying shade of blue. The tension broke as she looked up. Her eyes were glazed with exhaustion, but the moment they locked with mine, a spark of pure, defiant life returned to them. "You're late, Silas," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. I couldn't even answer. I just dragged myself toward her, the king and the vet, 2 souls lost in the dark. I realized then that the storm had swallowed my howl, but it couldn't swallow her heart. And as I looked at the pups she had saved, I knew I would never go back to the world I left behind. Chapter 7. The Fragile Shield. The cave was a tomb of ice, but the air inside hummed with the frantic, shallow breaths of the dying. I dragged my frozen body across the stone floor, my limbs moving like rusted gears. Truth be told, I had never felt smaller. I was a king of the greatest pack in the north, yet I was shivering like a pup while Clara Vance stood as the only thing between life and the abyss. "Don't touch them yet," Clara rasped, her voice cracking like dry parchment. I froze, my hand inches from Leo's frost-covered face. "He's blue, Clara. I need to warm him. My blood—" "Your blood is cooling, Silas," she interrupted, her moss-green eyes fierce even through the haze of exhaustion. "If you shift now, the sudden heat could send them into shock, and your fur is wet. Wet means death." Soon after, she reached into her medical bag and pulled out a thermal foil blanket, her fingers fumbling with the crinkling silver material. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as she stripped off her final insulating layer to press her bare skin against the smallest pup. She was using her own body heat, her fragile human warmth, to pull the frost out of a wolf's bones. It was madness. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "You're going to freeze," I whispered, my chest aching with a new kind of pain. "Then help me," she snapped, though her jaw was chattering so hard I feared her teeth would break. "Start the stove, bottom of the bag." I moved on instinct, my large, clumsy hands digging through her supplies. I found a small pressurized canister and a burner. It was human technology, simple and efficient. and in this whiteout, it was more powerful than any lunar blessing. As the small blue flame hissed to life, the shadows on the cave walls danced. What followed was a moment of silence, where the roar of the wind outside seemed to fade, replaced by the rhythmic hiss of the burner and the ragged gasps of the survivors. Chapter 8: The Weight of Glass. By the time the cave air lost its lethal edge, I was sitting against the far wall, watching Clara like a hawk. I realized then that my wolf instincts were failing me. The death frost had masked every scent and dulled my hearing. I couldn't smell the danger anymore, but Clara, she was watching the entrance with a different kind of focus. She wasn't relying on magic. She was relying on fear and preparation. "You're learning," she murmured, glancing at me as she wrapped Leo in a fresh bandage. "You're realizing that being a wolf doesn't make you invincible." "I thought humans were glass," I admitted, my voice a low, shamed rumble. "I thought you were something to be protected, not someone who could be protected." "Glass can be a lens, Silas," she replied, her eyes softening as she looked at the sleeping pups. "It can focus light. It can see things that are too thick to notice." Even so, the peace was short-lived. A beat later, the air in the cave grew heavy, smelling of wet earth and ancient, stagnant ice. My skin crawled. Beneath the moonlight filtering through the entrance, the snow began to swirl into a shape that wasn't made of wind. "Something is here," I growled, pushing myself up despite the protesting scream of my muscles. "A frost shade," Clara whispered, reaching for her bag. "They follow the scent of fading heartbeats. Your wolf can't bite a ghost, Silas." She was right. I lunged at the misty, skeletal figure that drifted into the cave mouth, but my claws passed through it like smoke. The creature let out a high-pitched, discordant shriek that felt like a needle in my brain. I felt a surge of helplessness that nearly broke me. I was a king, and I was useless against a shadow. "Get back!" Clara screamed. Without thinking, she grabbed a glass vial from her kit, a mixture of phosphorus and silver nitrate she used for cauterizing wounds. She smashed it against the stone floor at the creature's feet. A blinding flash of white and orange light erupted, the chemical fire hissing as it clung to the shade's ethereal form. The creature wailed, its form dissolving back into the blizzard as the heat tore it apart. Chapter 9: The Last Heartbeat. The tension broke, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Clara slumped against the cave wall, her face as white as the snow outside. I rushed to her side, catching her before her head hit the stone. "Clara, stay with me." "The pup," she choked out, pointing a trembling finger toward Leo. I looked down. The air of the Blackwood line was no longer shivering. His chest wasn't moving. The air, Leo, had stopped breathing. In the span of a breath, the weight of my entire failure crashed down on me. My fated mate had abandoned him, the elders had cursed him, and now, even with a human miracle, he was slipping away. "Move!" Clara commanded, her voice surging with a final, desperate energy. She crawled to the boy and began rhythmic compressions on his tiny chest. 1, 2, 3. She was pouring her remaining life into him, her hands pressing down with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone so small. "Come on, Leo," she sobbed, her tears freezing on her cheeks. "Don't you dare give up. Your uncle is right here. Breathe." I watched, my heart skipping beats in time with her hands. I felt the pack bond. It was a faint, tattered string pulling at my soul, telling me the lineage was broken. But then, Clara leaned down and blew air into the pup's lungs. She was sharing her own breath, her own spirit. And then, it happened. Leo let out a sharp, wet cough. He gasped, his small body racking with a violent shudder as his heart jump-started. He began to cry, a loud, healthy, primal sound that echoed through the cave. "He's back," I breathed, the world tilting as relief washed over me. Clara collapsed against my chest, her strength finally spent. I wrapped my arms around her, my large body finally acting as the shield she needed. In the quiet that followed, I realized the truth. She hadn't used supernatural power to save him. She had used choice. She had used love. "I've got you," I whispered into her hair, the scent of lavender finally returning to my senses. "I've got all of you." As fire bloomed beneath her skin from my touch, I knew the man I was before the storm was dead. The king who believed in bloodlines was gone. I was a king who had seen a human do what a wolf wouldn't, and as the storm roared outside, I knew the real fight had only just begun. Chapter 10. The Scalpel and the Sword. The morning light was a pale, sickly gray, filtering through the cave entrance like a cold shroud. I sat with my back against the frozen stone, my primal protection flared to its absolute limit. In the span of a breath, I could feel every fluttering heartbeat in the room. Clara was slumped against me, her breathing shallow but rhythmic, while the 4 pups huddled in a pile of thermal blankets and shared warmth. "Leo's heart is slowing again," I whispered, my voice a jagged rasp. Clara stirred, her eyes snapping open with a clarity that defied her exhaustion. She didn't waste words on a greeting. Instead, she crawled toward the boy, her movements stiff and mechanical. She pressed 2 fingers to his throat, her brow furrowing in a way that made my own chest ache. "The cold didn't just stop his heart, Silas," she murmured, reaching for her medical bag. "The pressure from the shivering caused a lung to collapse. I have to vent or he won't make it back to the hall." What followed was a display of precision that felt like a holy ritual. I watched as she pulled a long, hollow needle from a sterile pack. My wolf roared in the back of my mind. Everything in my nature told me to protect the pup from the iron she held. Yet, I forced myself to be her anchor. I held Leo's small, shaking shoulders down as she positioned the needle. "I've got him," I promised, my gold eyes locking onto hers. "Hold him steady," she replied, her voice dropping into that deep, calm frequency that seemed to command the very air. Before the words left her lips, she drove the needle home. A sharp hiss of escaping air whistled through the cave, followed by Leo's sudden, deep gasp of life. The pressure in his chest eased, and his heartbeat stabilized under my palm, strong, steady, and defiant. In that moment, I realized I trusted this human woman more than I trusted my own gods. She didn't have a healing factor, but she had a will that could bend the laws of death. Chapter 11. The Flicker of the Faded Thread. The storm outside had died down to a bitter, biting wind, but the death frost still hung in the air like a curse. I stood up, preparing to lead our small, broken pack back toward civilization. As I reached out to help Clara to her feet, our skin met. And just like that, everything changed. The faded bond around my wrist, the invisible, magical, golden cuff that tied me to Alara, suddenly flared with a blinding, sickly light. It pulsed with a cold, possessive energy trying to remind me of my destiny. But as the silence roared between us, the light began to flicker. Under the weight of my stare, the golden glow dimmed, turning a muddy gray as it touched the heat of Clara's palm. "Silas?" Clara whispered, her breath catching. "Your wrist. It's glowing." "It's dying," I realized, the truth unraveling in my mind like a frayed rope. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was the goddess finally opening her eyes. I saw the bond for what it truly was, a cage designed to keep the pack stagnant. It flickered because my heart was no longer in the hall. It was here, in the dirt and the ice, with a woman who had earned her place through blood and sacrifice. "Alara didn't just stay behind," I said, my voice dripping with a newfound venom. "She wanted this. She wanted the weak to be culled so she could rule without the burden of the vulnerable." "She's your mate, Silas," Clara said, though she didn't pull her hand away. "She is a mistake," I countered. Not only that, but I realized the stakes were now higher than they had ever been. If the bond was failing, Alara would feel it. She would know that her king was slipping through her fingers. As the wind shifted, carrying a scent of wet fur and sharpened steel, I knew she had already reacted. Chapter 12. The Executioner's Scent. We began the trek back, a slow and agonizing procession through the knee-deep drifts. I carried Leo and the smallest pup in my arms, while Clara guided the other two, her hand never leaving the hilt of her flare gun. Still, the peace was a lie. The air thickened with a smell I knew all too well, the scent of the retrievers, the pack's elite guard, trained only for the kill. "They're close," I muttered, my instincts surging as I scanned the ridgeline. "Is it a rescue party?" Clara asked, her eyes searching the whiteout. "No," I replied, my growl vibrating through the pups I held. "They aren't here to save the children. They're here to ensure the children don't return to tell the truth." What followed was the sound of a dozen paws hitting the snow in perfect, lethal unison. Without warning, 4 massive, gray-furred wolves crested the ridge above us. They didn't howl in greeting. They stood in a silent, predatory semicircle. These were Alara's loyalists, the traditionalists who believed that a king who defied his mate was a king who deserved to bleed. "Silas Vane!" The lead wolf shifted, his human form appearing in a blur of fur and shadow. It was Varric, Alara's most brutal captain. "Luna has declared you compromised. You are to hand over the human thief and the tainted pups for purification." "Purification?" I stepped forward, the space between us burning with my rage. "You mean execution?" "The law is the law," Varric spat, his eyes flashing a cold, mindless silver. "The fated bond is our strength. You have broken it. Now, you pay." The wolves appearing on the ridge weren't a rescue party. They were an execution squad. As the sky darkened with the promise of more snow, I looked at Clara. She didn't look like glass anymore. She looked like a soldier. "Get behind me," I commanded, my voice the only law left in this forest. The tension broke. Varric shifted back into his beast form, and with every heartbeat, the circle drew tighter. I was exhausted, wounded, and carrying the future of my pack in my arms. But as I looked into Clara's moss-green eyes, I felt a power no fated bond could ever give. Chapter 13. The Alpha's Treason. The air didn't just turn cold, it turned murderous. I stood my ground as Varric's squad circled us, their paws crunching the frozen crust of the snow like breaking bone. Truth be told, I was a king without a crown in that moment, but I had never felt more like a leader. I handed Leo and the pups to Clara, my eyes never leaving the yellow-eyed predators in front of us. "If you touch her, Varric," I rumbled, my voice vibrating with a primal frequency that made the nearby trees shiver, "I will peel the pelt from your back while you still breathe." "You are weak, Silas," Varric barked, his human form shimmering through a half-shift that made his face a nightmare of hair and teeth. "You choose a human medic over your fated Luna. You have abandoned the moon goddess's plan." Without warning, the lead wolf lunged. Her body moved on instinct, but mine was faster. I didn't shift. Not yet. I met his 500-pound frame with my bare, human hands, the impact echoing through the barrens like a thunderclap. We tumbled into the drifts, a mess of leather and fur. Still, I felt the fire of Clara's gaze on my back, and it gave me a strength no lunar blessing ever could. I caught Varric by the throat, my fingers digging into his matted fur. The goddess didn't plan for a murderer to wear the mantle of Luna, I hissed into his ear. I threw him back with a roar of pure defiance. What followed was a blur of violence. I wasn't fighting for territory or rank anymore. I was fighting for the life of the woman who had taught me how to breathe again. Varric's men hesitated, their instincts confused by the sight of their king fighting as a man, yet carrying the aura of a god. Even so, the numbers were against me. I felt the sharp sting of claws across my ribs, a hot reminder of my mortality. Chapter 14. The Blood Mark. "Silas, get back!" Clara screamed, her voice cutting through the snarls. She didn't just watch. Rather, she pulled a silver-tipped tranquilizer pistol from her bag, a tool for sedating rogue bears, and fired. The dart buried itself in the shoulder of a wolf lunging for my neck. The beast yelped, his legs buckling as the high-grade sedative hit his system. Because of that distraction, I was able to break free of the circle. I reached Clara's side, my chest heaving, blood soaking through my torn tunic. "We have to go," she panted, her eyes wide with terror and resolve. They won't stop. I know, I whispered, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I realized then that if we reached the hall as we were, the elders would execute her before I could say a word. I needed a way to bind her to the pack's law, a way to force them to recognize her. In the quiet that followed the first skirmish, I made a choice that would haunt the history books. I took my hunting knife and drew it across my own palm, the copper scent of royal blood filling the air. "What are you doing?" Clara gasped, her voice trembling. "I'm committing treason," I replied. Before she could move, I pressed my blood-stained palm against the side of her neck. As the mark tingled, I poured my intent, my soul, and my alpha authority into the touch. It was a claiming, a temporary mark used for high-ranking spies or concubines, but on a human it was a scandal beyond repair. As her skin absorbed the heat of my blood, a faint silver-crimson glow pulsed beneath her flesh. "Now you are mine," I growled, my gold eyes burning. "The pack cannot kill you without killing me first." Chapter 15. The Walls of Ice. By the time we reached the gates of the Great Hall, the sun had begun to dip behind the peaks, casting long, jagged shadows across the stone. The heavy iron doors swung open, but there was no welcome. Instead, we were met by a wall of spears. Ilara stood at the head of the formation, her face a mask of cold, calculating fury. "You brought the thief back," she said, her voice a whip crack that echoed in the courtyard. "And you have dared to mark her with royal blood?" "I brought our future back, Ilara," I shouted, holding Leo high so the gathered pack could see. "The pups are alive because of this woman. While you sat by the fire, she bled for your people." The tension broke as whispers rippled through the crowd. I saw mothers looking at their children, then at Clara, their eyes softening with a dangerous realization. Not only that, but the elders stepped forward, their faces etched with traditionalist horror. They saw the mark on Clara's neck and knew I had broken the most sacred law of the Blackwood. "Silas Vane," the High Elder spoke, his voice like dry leaves. "You have placed a human above your fated mate. You have used your blood to shield a trespasser. This is an abomination." "The abomination is a Luna who lets children die," I countered, my voice booming. "Seize them!" Ilara shrieked, her composure finally shattering. "Strip him of his title. He is bewitched by her human filth." What's worse, the guards moved. I felt Clara's hand tighten on my arm, her heartbeat racing against mine. I stood my ground, my wolf roaring in my mind, ready to tear the world apart to keep her safe. But as the spears closed in, I realized I had reached the point of no return. I was no longer just a king fighting for a crown. I was a man fighting for his soul. "If you want my crown, Ilara," I whispered, my eyes locking onto hers, "you'll have to take it from my cold, dead hands." The guards lunged, and Silas felt the crushing weight of the pack's judgment fall. He was stripped of his cloak, his sword, and his dignity. But as they dragged him toward the dungeons, he kept his eyes on Clara. She was being pulled toward the gallows tree, her eyes filled with a terrifying, silent courage. Chapter 16. The Iron Silence. The dungeon was a throat of cold stone that swallowed every sound but the dripping of melted ice. I was chained to the wall with silver-weighted manacles that burned like liquid fire every time I breathed. Truth be told, the physical pain was a mercy compared to the roar of failure in my head. Through the narrow, barred window of my cell, I could see the courtyard where the gallows tree stood, a twisted ancient oak used for those who dared to defy the goddess. "You look pathetic, Silas," a voice chimed, cutting through the dark. Ilara stepped into the flickering torchlight outside my bars, her white furs pristine and smelling of expensive jasmine. She looked at my bleeding wrists with a detached, clinical interest. What followed was a cold realization that I had never truly known the woman I was supposed to be fated to. "The boy is dying, you know," she said, her voice a casual breeze. "Leo's lung is failing again. The elders have forbidden the human from touching him. They say if the goddess wants the heir to live, she will mend him without the help of a thief." "She saved him once, Ilara," I roared. my chains rattling with a violent metallic clank. Let her go to him. If you let that child die to spite me, you aren't a Luna. You're a monster. I am a realist, she countered, leaning closer to the bars. I will let the pup die so we can start fresh. We will have a new, stronger heir, Silas, one not tainted by your weakness or her touch. To make things worse, the elders have already signed the decree. At dawn she hangs, and you will watch from this very window. She turned on her heel, her laughter echoing down the damp corridor like the breaking of glass. I slumped against the wall, my heart skipping a heartbeat as the reality of my descent hit me. I had lost my crown. I had lost my pack. And now I was going to lose the only woman who had ever truly seen me. Chapter 17. The death howl hours passed in a blur of silver-induced fever. I tried to shift, my bones snapping and grinding as I fought to reach my wolf, but the silver bars of the cage acted like a parasite, draining my energy the moment it surged. The pack spirit, that humming vibration of 1,000 connected souls, was fading from my mind. I felt a hollow, aching void where my power used to be. Still, I kept my eyes on the cell next to mine. It was empty of furniture, just a cold stone box where Clara sat huddled in the corner. She looked so small, so fragile, yet she hadn't cried. Not once. Clara, I whispered, my voice a broken rasp. I can hear him, Silas, she said, her voice trembling but clear. Leo, he's in the room above us, his breathing. It's rattling. He needs a chest tube. He needs me. I'm sorry, I choked out, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. I'm so sorry I brought you into this. Don't, she said, moving to the bars separating us. She reached through, her warm fingers brushing my bruised knuckles. I chose this, Silas. I chose to walk into that storm. I'd do it again. Without warning, a sound erupted from the great hall above, a long, mournful, high-pitched cry that vibrated through the very foundations of the castle. It was the death howl. The pack was mourning the air. The sound was a physical blow, a declaration that my legacy was gone and my bloodline was severed. I felt the loss of an ally, a resource, and a future all in one breath. No, I breathed, my world tilting into utter darkness. No, not Leo. Chapter 18. The Dark Night of the Soul. The silence that followed the howl was worse than the screaming. I sank to the floor, the silver manacles heavy as lead. I had reached the all-is-lost moment. I looked at my hands, the hands of a king who couldn't protect a child, the hands of a warrior who couldn't break a single iron bar. My deepest fear had come true. I was a failure. Maybe it was fate's final cruelty, or maybe it was the crucible I needed. As the silence roared, I looked at Clara. She was staring at the ceiling, her lips moving in a silent prayer, her face etched with a quiet, terrifying courage. I realized then my internal flaw. I had spent my entire life thinking that power came from the wolf. I thought I needed claws to lead and magic to be strong. But Clara was just a human. She had no claws. She had no healing factor. Yet she was the one who was still standing in her soul, while I was kneeling in mine. Goddess, I whispered, closing my eyes and turning my face toward the cold stone. I don't care about the crown. I don't care about the bond. If you are listening, take my life. Take my soul. Just give her the chance to save what's left, please. I felt a sudden, sharp prickling on the back of my neck. It wasn't silver. It was something else. A warmth that started in my chest and began to spread. The shadows in the room didn't disappear, but they began to glow with a faint, ethereal silver light. Beneath the weight of my stare, the silver manacles didn't break, but they felt lighter. As the truth unraveled in my mind, I realized that the moon goddess wasn't interested in kings. She was interested in mothers. And as the wind shifted outside, carrying the scent of a new, even more powerful storm, I knew that the all-is-lost moment was just the beginning of the end. The cell door didn't open, but the shadows in the room began to glow, and I felt a spark of something primal, something human, stirring in the dark. Chapter 19. The Rising Spark. The silver light didn't just glow, It hummed, a low vibration that resonated in my very marrow. I stared at the shadows dancing on the dungeon floor, my heart skipping a beat as the silence of the death howl was replaced by a frantic tapping at the heavy oak door. Truth be told, I expected Alara's executioners, but when the door creaked open, it was a face I hadn't seen since the storm began. It was Cale, the young guard whose brother Clara had saved in Act 1. He was pale, his hands shaking as he fumbled with a heavy ring of iron keys. Before she could move, Clara stood up, her eyes wide with a sudden, desperate hope. "The heir. He's not gone," Cale whispered, his voice a jagged thread of sound. "He's fading, but his heart still beats. The High Elder is preparing the pyre, but I couldn't let it happen. Not after what she did for my family." He fumbled with the lock on my cage. The moment the iron teeth turned, the silver manacles fell away with a heavy clatter. I lunged forward, catching Cale by the shoulders. My strength was returning, not from the moon, but from a raw, human resolve that felt like liquid fire in my veins. "The clinic bag," I commanded, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Where is it?" "Alara threw it in the courtyard fire," Cale said, his eyes filled with shame. "But I saved what I could. I hid her surgical kit beneath the dais." Soon after, I reached through the bars of Clara's cell, pulling her into my arms the moment her door swung open. She felt like a bird, small, fragile, but her heart was drumming against mine with a rhythm that demanded action. What followed was a choice that would define the rest of my life. I didn't shift into a wolf. I stayed on 2 feet, honoring the human strength that had carried us this far. Chapter 20. The Journey to the Dais. We moved through the service tunnels like ghosts, Cale leading the way while I kept a protective arm around Clara. The air in the castle smelled of smoke and ancient, dusty tradition. I could feel the pack spirit above us. It was confused, mourning, and fractured. To make things worse, the moon was nearly fully eclipsed now, a blood-red eye looking down on a kingdom of shadows. "We're going to the sacred dais," I told Clara, my gold eyes flashing in the dark. "Silas, they'll kill you for this," she whispered, though she didn't slow her pace. "Let them try," I countered. As the silence roared around us, we reached the heavy stone doors leading to the courtyard. I could hear the High Elder's voice, a rhythmic, droning chant that signaled the start of the final rites. Beneath the moonlight, the pack had gathered in a massive, silent circle, their eyes fixed on the small, limp body of Leo, laying on the white marble dais. Alara stood beside the High Elder, her white furs glowing like a bone in the dark. "Now," I whispered to Cale. Without warning, I kicked the doors open. The sound was like a thunderclap, echoing off the stone peaks and drawing 1,000 pairs of yellow eyes toward us. I stepped into the torchlight, not as a king with a crown, but as a man with a purpose. Chapter 21. The Trial of the Goddess. "Stop!" my voice boomed, shattering the High Elder's chant. The tension broke as the guards leveled their spears. Ilara's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. In fact, she looked like she wanted to tear the world apart with her bare hands. "The traitor returns!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Kill him! Kill the human usurper!" "Wait!" the High Elder commanded, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. He looked at me, then at Clara, his eyes narrowed with a sudden, sharp curiosity. "Silas Vane, you have escaped your judgment. Why do you interrupt the goddess's final mercy?" "Because there is no mercy in a lie," I shouted, stepping onto the marble platform. I pointed at Leo. "He still breathes, and this woman can save him. If you are so certain she is a thief, then let the goddess decide. I demand a trial by dais." A collective gasp rippled through the pack. A trial by dais was an ancient law, one that hadn't been invoked in 3 centuries. It meant that if the person failed, their soul was forfeit to the frost. Yet, Clara didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her head held high, looking every bit a queen in her tattered, blood-stained clothes. "I can save him," she said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the chaos. "But I need my kit." and I need the king to stand guard." Ilara stepped forward, her eyes flashing a lethal silver. "She is a fraud. If she touches that boy, his blood is on your hands, Silas." "Then if I fail, my life for him," I declared, the words hanging in the air like a vow. What followed was a moment where time seemed to stand still. The High Elder looked from me to Ilara, then finally at the dying boy. He stepped back, gesturing toward the dais. Clara moved instantly, retrieving her hidden kit from beneath the marble. I stood between her and the pack, my muscles coiled like a spring, my eyes locked on Ilara. "Do what the king cannot," I whispered to Clara. She knelt beside Leo, and as she pulled out a silver-lined scalpel, the sky cracked open with a flash of ethereal lunar light. The final push had begun. Chapter 22. And the sky cracks open. The air on the dais didn't just thicken, it turned to liquid electricity. I stood like a wall of iron, my feet planted on the white marble as the pack closed in, a sea of snarling fur and flashing silver spears. Truth be told, I was a dead man if Clara failed, but as I watched her hands move, I felt a strange, terrifying peace. She wasn't just a medic, she was a sculptor carving a miracle out of the cold. "Hold his shoulder, Silas. Now," she commanded. I knelt, my massive hand steadying the boy as she made the incision. Blood, hot and red, spilled onto the pristine marble, and the traditionalists let out a collective howl of horror. Yet, the sky responded in a way none of us expected. The blood-red eclipse reached its zenith, and a bolt of ethereal white lightning tore through the clouds. It didn't strike the earth. It struck the space between me and Ilara. The fated thread, that golden, choking cord of destiny, finally snapped with a sound like a harp string breaking. In that moment, the space between us burned with a heat so intense I had to shield my eyes. Ilara shrieked, clutching her wrist as the golden mark on her skin turned to black ash. "The bond!" the High Elder gasped, falling to his knees. "It is severed!" But then, the focus shifted back to the center of the dais. Clara had inserted a small, clear tube into Leo's chest. A beat later, the boy's body convulsed. He let out a sharp, ragged cry that cut through the silence of the forest like a blade. His eyes snapped open, gold, bright, and full of life. He was breathing. The air was back. Chapter 23. The Choice of the Goddess. What followed was a moment of divine judgment. The air began to swirl with silver mist, and the Great Mother herself seemed to manifest in the very wind that whipped around us. Her voice didn't come from the sky. It came from the hearts of everyone present. "Motherhood is a choice, not a birthright," the wind whispered, the words vibrating in my bones. Ilara lunged forward, a silver dagger hidden in her furs, her face a mask of demonic fury. "I am Luna! This is my throne!" Before she could move, the silver light from the eclipse centered on Clara. It was a transformation more romantic and intense than anything I had ever witnessed. Clara's human form didn't break or snap. It was simply enhanced. A wolf soul, shimmering and ancient, merged with her spirit. Her hair glowed like moonlight, and her eyes turned a piercing royal violet. "You are nothing," Clara said, her voice carrying the weight of a goddess. With a single wave of her hand, a pulse of lunar energy sent Ilara flying backward, stripping the icy power from her limbs. The traditionalists watched in awe as Ilara's fur turned gray and patchy, her connection to the pack spirit vanishing forever. She was no longer a Luna. She was a pariah. "Exile her," I commanded, my voice booming with a power that was now mine by choice, not by blood. Let the cold barrens she loved so much be her only kingdom. Chapter 24. The first breath of spring. Come morning, the thaw had begun. The supernatural blizzard didn't just stop, it melted into 1,000 crystal streams that fed the thirsty earth. I sat on the porch of the rebuilt fringe clinic, my hand intertwined with Clara's. In fact, the mark on my wrist was gone, replaced by a simple band of braided silver that she had given me. "You look different as a wolf," I teased, watching her golden white fur catch the morning sun as she shifted to play with Leo in the grass. "I feel different," she laughed, her voice a melody that finally matched the peace in my heart. "I feel like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." Eventually, the pack understood. A leader who chooses tradition over life is no leader at all. We had created a new era where the fringe was no longer a border, but a bridge. As the silence of the old world roared into the music of the new, I realized my transformation was complete. I had started as a prisoner of iron and fate, and I had finished as a master of heart and choice. And just like that, everything changed. The gray fringe was now a bustling hub where humans and wolves walked side by side. I watched Clara pick up her medical bag, her eyes reflecting the violet light of the moon that had saved us. She was the true Luna, not because she was born to it, but because she had bled for it. "Ready to run, Silas?" she asked, her wolf pressing forward. "Always," I whispered. As the wind carried her name through the trees, I followed her into the green. We weren't just a king and a Luna. We were two souls who had survived the frost and found the sun. Deep down, I knew the truth. The heart of the thaw wasn't the end of winter. It was the beginning of us. Epilogue scene. 1 year later, the great hunt is different. Silas and Clara lead the pack not through fear, but through a bond that pulses with every heartbeat. As they reach the edge of the territory, they see their children playing in the grass. Silas realizes that nature's way isn't about the strong surviving, it's about the loving staying together. Her bones remembered him, and his soul answered. And as they shifted under the silver moonlight, the forest held its breath, witnessing a love that had changed the world.